Hello and welcome back to RotoBaller Starts and Sits for 2024. I'm Matt Donnelly and I'm going to break it all down for you, starting with the running back position here. If you've got questions, I've got the answers. And with week 1 of the NFL season upon us, it's time to make those difficult fantasy football decisions. Now, the week number 1 is like a heavyweight title battle here. Both teams kind of feeling each other out, a little bit of sparring, a little bit of jabbing from time to time as we try to figure out which offenses are going to explode and which defenses are going to be better than advertised. By doing so, we are able to kind of exploit those matchups throughout the season. Now, drawing from last season and what we kind of saw and how things kind of played out, and keeping that one eye kind of focused throughout the training camp this season, we're able to identify which running backs I feel are worth starting this week, and a few of them that should probably remain on the bench until we see a little bit more action from their team. The first running back I want to talk about is Javante Williams of the Denver Broncos as they take on the Seattle Seahawks. Seattle allowed the 6th most fantasy points last season to the running back position on a per game basis, yielding 23.5 per contest. That was thanks in large part to surrendering the 5th most rushing yards, 1,815, and also giving up 19 touchdowns on the ground. Only the Carolina Panthers allowed more. What makes this even more of an interesting play is the Seattle Seahawks allowed 81 receptions to running backs last season. And Javante Williams, he caught 47 of 58 targets while returning from a knee injury. Factoring the whole Jaleel McLaughlin there, his 31 receptions, and Samaje Perine's departure that vacates 56 additional targets, one can safely assume that Williams is going to be once again heavily involved in this passing game. It also bodes well for Williams that Bo Nix targeted his running backs more than any other quarterback last season that was in this draft class. Number 2 running back that I'm looking at this week, how about James Cook of the Buffalo Bills as they take on the Arizona Cardinals? Last season, no team, I'm going to say that again, no team allowed more fantasy production to running backs than the Arizona Cardinals. Arizona allowed backs to churn out 2,027 yards on the ground and 14 touchdowns, in addition to the 8 receiving touchdowns that they gifted fantasy managers. The 26.83 fantasy points per game were more than a full fantasy point than the next closest team, and that was the Washington Commanders. Enter James Cook. Cook finished last season with 1,122 yards on the ground while also chipping in 445 yards on 44 receptions. Once Joe Brady took over the play calling duties in Buffalo, Cook would go on to average 20.4 opportunities per game. And guess what? There's going to be more opportunities this season. No Stephon Diggs, no Gabriel Davis. Cook, he's going to have plenty of opportunities to prove himself to start the 2024 campaign. Another great matchup that you have to look at is Gus Edwards and the Los Angeles Chargers as they take on the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, I'm reading the tea leaves here, and if you need a flex option, Gus Edwards is likely an option that's sitting on your bench here in week number 1 that's going to ball out when it comes to fantasy. All offseason, all we've heard is this Chargers team is going to lean heavily on the run. We know Jim Harbaugh, what he likes to do. He's a 3 yards in a cloud of dust kind of guy. Greg Roman, he's kind of calling the shots there. If the ground and pound wasn't already obvious, how about the fact that we're talking about plantar fasciitis when it comes to one of the best quarterbacks in the game? That's right, Justin Herbert is dealing with a foot injury there, and that would suggest an added emphasis on the run game through the first several weeks of the 2024 season. From a fantasy lens, the Raiders allowed 1,667 rushing yards to the running back position last season, along with 13 scores. That added up to 21.55 fantasy points per game. That was the 6th most, which means Edwards and the Chargers may be able to exploit this matchup. The Harbaugh brothers, they like to talk. There's an excellent reason why the Chargers didn't draft a running back until the 6th round in Kimani Vidal. Now, Edwards, he's going to see those goal line touches, and we know he punched that ball in 13 times a season ago. J.K. Dobbins, he's going to be a factor, just not here in week number 1. As for the running backs that I'm sitting this week, Brian Robinson Jr. of the Washington Commanders against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. You may have heard of an interior redesigner in Vita Vea, one of the premier interior run defenders in the game today, playing on one of the most dominant run defenses last season. Tampa Bay, they allowed just 1,377 rushing yards and just 5 rushing touchdowns to backs last season. The 5 rushing touchdowns, that was tied with the Baltimore Ravens for the fewest in the NFL. And it's not just that the Buccaneers' run defense was good, they also eliminated opposing backs to the 3rd fewest receiving yards, 435, and just 2 receiving scores. Those 7 touchdowns were the fewest surrendered in the entire NFL, while the 17.44 fantasy points per game, that was the 5th lowest. With better options available facing more favorable matchups, the duo of Brian Robinson Jr. and Austin Eckler is a hard no for me. Another guy that I'm fading this week, DeAndre Swift of the Chicago Bears against the Tennessee Titans. Speaking of difficult matchups, the Tennessee Titans have been one of the more difficult matchups for running backs over the last few seasons. In 2021, the Titans surrendered just 10.19 fantasy points per game, a number only bested by the Miami Dolphins and the Indianapolis Colts. In that season, they allowed just 1,089 rushing yards to the position. Then in 2022, they finished as the second stingiest unit in the league, allowing just 907 rushing yards and 6 touchdowns. That added up to 13.58 fantasy points. Last season, the Titans defensive unit ranked 7th in fantasy points allowed, yielding 17.85 fantasy points per contest. Now that number is somewhat misleading considering the Titans were dealing with a plethora of injuries on their defensive front last season, including Jeffrey Sims, and you know he is another bad man that I like to talk about. Not only is this Tennessee run defense enough of a reason to fade DeAndre Swift here in week number 1, but their pass defense last season was amongst the 10 worst in the league, allowing more than 33 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. In Chicago, they got themselves some new toys: Caleb Williams, Keenan Allen, Rome Odunze to go along with DJ Moore. Expect them to throw the ball here in week number 1. And finally, I am fading Najee Harris of the Pittsburgh Steelers against the Atlanta Falcons. One of the more underrated defenses in the NFL last season, it was the Atlanta Falcons. 8th most challenging matchup when it came to opposing wide receivers, there, allowing just 27.78 fantasy points per game. They were also the 8th stingiest defense when it came to the running back position, allowing less than 18 fantasy points per game. Along with the Buccaneers and the Ravens, they also allowed the league fewest 5 rushing scores. Now, considering where you drafted Harris, you likely have better options there on your bench. Harris, he's a great option this season. This is the best he's looked in quite some time, and this is probably the best offensive line that he's played with since being in the league. I also know that Arthur Smith is the offensive coordinator in Pittsburgh, and that is enough for me to pump the brakes right there until I feel how this tandem is going to work here in Pittsburgh. Who knows what Arthur Smith's going to do? We may even see the biggest fantasy impact coming from Cordell Patterson. With that all being said, you know I have trust issues, and Arthur Smith is probably the root of all. But the one thing I do trust is RotoBaller.com and the Discord channel. So pound that like button, hit that subscribe button, and make sure to head over to the RotoBaller Discord channel for all the latest fantasy football news.